Welcome back. Are you ready to hear some more about Santa Claus and how he becomes a man? That's what we're going to do today. The next section is called Manhood. And the first chapter is The Laughing Valley. When Klaus came to the valley, it was empty, save for the grass, the brooks, the wildflowers, the bees, and the butterflies. If he would have made his home here and live after the fashion of men, he must have a house. This puzzled him at first, but while he stood smiling in the sunshine, he suddenly found himself beside the old Nelko, the servant of the master woodsman. Nelko, he bore an axe, strong and broad, with blade that gleamed like burnished silver. This he placed in the young man's hand, and then he disappeared without a word. Klaus understood, and turning to the forest edge, he selected a number of fallen tree trunks, which he began to clear of their dead branches. He would not cut into a living tree. His life among the nymphs who guarded the forest had taught him that a live tree is sacred because it created things endowed with feelings. But with the dead and fallen trees, it was different. They have fulfilled their destiny as active members of the forest, and now it was fitting that their remains should be ministered to the needs of man. The axe bit deep into the logs at every stroke. It seemed to have a force of its own, and Klaus had but to swing and guide it. When shadows began creeping over the green hills to lie in the valley overnight, the young man had chopped many logs into equal lengths and proper shapes for building a house such as he had seen the poorer classes of men inhabit. Then, resolving to wait another day before he tried to fit the logs together, Klaus ate some of the sweet roots he knew well how to find. He drank deeply from the laughing brook and lay down to sleep on the grass, first seeking a spot where no flowers grew, lest the weight of his body should crush them. And while he slumbered, he breathed in the perfume of the wondrous valley of the spirit of happiness, crept into his heart, and it drove out all terror and care and misgivings. Nevermore would the face of Klaus be clouded with anxieties. Nevermore would the trials of life weigh him down as with a burden. The Laughing Valley had claimed him as its own. Would that all might live in the delightful place, but maybe it would become overcrowded. For ages it had waited attendant. Was it the chance that led young Klaus to make his home in this happy vale? Or may we guess that his thoughtful friends, the immortals, had directed his steps when he wandered away from Burzy to seek a home of his own in the world? Certainly it is that while the moon peered over the hilltop and flooded with its soft beams the body of the sleeping stranger, the Laughing Valley was filled with queer, crooked shapes of friendly Nooks. These people spoke no words, but worked with skill and swiftness. The logs Klaus had trimmed with his bright axe were carried to a spot beside the brook and fitted one upon the other. During the night, a strong and roomy dwelling was built. The birds came sweeping into the valley at daybreak, and their songs, so seldom heard in the deep wood, aroused the stranger. He rubbed the web of sleep from his eyelids and looked around. The house met his gaze. "I must thank the Nooks for this," said he gratefully. Then he walked to his dwelling and entered at the doorway. A large room faced him, having a fireplace at the end and a table and a bench, and in the middle, beside the fireplace, was a cupboard. Another doorway was beyond that. Klaus entered here, and also smaller rooms with a bed against the wall and a stool set near a small stand. On the bed were many layers of dry moss brought from the forest. "Indeed, it is a palace," exclaimed the smiling Klaus. "I must thank the good Nooks again for their knowledge of man's needs, as well as their labors in my behalf." He left his new home with a glad feeling that he was not quite alone in this world. Although he had chosen to abandon the forest life, friendships are not easily broken, and the immortals, they're everywhere. Upon reaching the brook, he drank of the pure water, and then he sat down on the bank to laugh at the mischievous gambols and the ripples as they pushed one another aside over the rocks and crowded desperately to see which could get around the turn first. And as they raced away, he listened to the song that they sang. Rushing, pushing, on we go. Not a wave may gently flow. All are too excited. Every drop, delighted, turns to spray in merry play as we tumble on our way. Next, Claus searched for roots to eat, while the daffodils turned their little eyes up to him laughingly and lisped their dainty little song. Blooming fairly, growing warely, never flowers were so gay. Perfume breathing, joy bequeathing, as our colors we display. It made Klaus laugh to hear the little things voice their happiness as they nodded gracefully on their stems. But another strain caught his ears. The sunbeams fell gently across his face and whispered, Here is gladness that our rays warm the valley through the days. Here is happiness to give, comfort unto all who live. Yes, cried Klaus in an answer, there is happiness and joy in all things here. The Laughing Valley is a valley of peace and goodwill. He passed the day talking with the ants and the beetles and exchanging jokes with the light-hearted butterflies. And at night, he lay on his bed of soft moss and slept so soundly. Then came the fairies, merry but noiseless, bringing skillets and pots and pans and dishes and all the tools necessary to prepare food and to comfort a mortal. With these they filled cupboards and the fireplace, finally placing a stout suit of wool clothing on the stool by his bedside. When Klaus awoke, he rubbed his eyes again and he laughed and spoke aloud his thanks to the fairies and the master woodsman who had sent them. With eager joy he examined all his new possessions, wondering what might be they used for. But the days when he had chugged in the girdle to the great Ak and visited the cities of men, his eyes had been quick to note all the manners and customs of his race, to which he belonged, so he guessed from the gifts brought by the fairies that the master expected him hereafter to live in the fashion of his fellow creatures. Which means that I must plow the earth and plant corn, he reflected, so that when winter comes I have gathered food in plenty. But as he stood in the grassy valley, he saw that to turn up the earth in furrows would be to destroy hundreds of pretty helpless flowers, as well as thousands of blades of grass, and this he could not bear to do. Therefore he stretched out his arms and uttered a peculiar whistle he had learned in the forest, afterward crying, Ryl of the field flowers, come to me. Instantly, a dozen of the queer little Ryls were squatting upon the ground before him, and they nodded to him cheerfully, greeting him. Klaus gazed upon them earnestly. Your brothers of the forest, he said, I have known and loved for many years. I shall love you. Also, when we have become friends, to me the law of the Ryls, whether those of the forest or of the fields, are sacred. I have never willfully destroyed one of the flowers you tend so carefully, but I must plant grain for use of food during the cold winters. And how am I to do this without killing the little creatures that sing to me so prettily of the fragrant blossoms? The yellow Ryl, he who tends the buttercups, made answer. Fret not, friend Claus. The great Ak has spoken to us of you. There is no better work for you in the life than to labor for food, and though not being of the forest, Ak has no command over us. Nevertheless, are we glad to favor one he loves? Live, therefore, know to do the good work you are resolved to undertake. We, the field Ryls, will attend to your food supplies. After this speech, the Ryls were no longer to be seen, and Klaus drove from his mind the thought of tilling the earth. When next he wandered back to his dwelling, a bowl of fresh milk stood upon the table. Bread was in the cupboard, and sweet honey filled a dish beside it. A pretty basket of rosy apples and newly plucked grapes were also awaiting him. He called out, "Thanks, my friends," to the invisible Ryls, and straightway began to eat of the food. Thereafter, when hungry, he had but to look into the cupboards to find goodly supplies brought by the kindly Ryls. And the Nooks, they cut and stacked much wood for his fireplace, and the fairies, they brought him warm blankets and clothing. So began his life in the Laughing Valley, with the favor and friendship of the immortals to every one of his wants. Chapter the 2nd. How Klaus made his first toy. Truly, our Klaus had wisdom for his good fortune, but strengthened his resolve to befriend the little ones of his own race. He knew his plan was approved by the immortals, else would they have not favored him so greatly. So he began at once to make acquaintance with mankind. He walked through the valley to the plain beyond, and crossed the plain in many directions to the abodes of men. These stood singly or in groups of dwellings called villages, and in nearly all the villages, big or small, Klaus found children. The youngsters soon came to know his merry, laughing face, and the kind glance of his bright eyes, and parents, while they regarded the young man with some scorn for loving children more than their elders, were content that the girls and boys had found a playfellow who seemed willing to amuse them. So the children romped and played games with Klaus, and the boys rode upon his shoulders, and the girls nestled in his strong arms, and the babies, they clung fondly to his knees. Whenever the young man chanced to be, the sound of childish laughter followed him, and to understand this better, you must know that children were much neglected in these days, and received little attention from their parents, so that it became to them a marvel that as goodly a man as Klaus devoted his time to making them happy. And those who knew him were, you may be sure, very happy indeed. The sad faces of the poor and abused grew bright for once. The cripple smiled despite his misfortune. The ailing ones hushed their moans, and the grieved ones their cries, when their merry friend came nigh to comfort them. Only at the beautiful palace of the Lord of Lords and at the frowning castle of the Baron Braun was Klaus refused admittance. There were children at both places, but the servants at the palace shut the door in the young stranger's face, and the fierce baron, he threatened to hang him from an iron hook on the castle wall. Whereupon Klaus sighed and went back to the poor dwellings where he was welcome. After a time, winter drew near. The flowers lived out their lives and faded and disappeared. The beetles burrowed far into the warm earth. The butterflies deserted the meadows, and the voice of the brook grew hoarse, as if it had taken cold. One day, snowflakes filled all the air in the Laughing Valley, dancing boisterously toward the earth, and clothed in pure white raiment the roof of Klaus's dwelling. At night, Jack Frost rapped at the door. "Come in," cried Klaus. "Come out," answered Jack, "for you have a fire inside." So Klaus came out. He had known Jack Frost in the forest, and liked the jolly rogue even when he mistrusted him. "There will be rare sport for me tonight, Klaus," shouted the sprite. "Isn't this glorious weather? I shall nip scores of noses and ears and toes before daybreak." "If you love me, Jack, spare the children," begged Klaus. "And why?" asked the other in surprise. "They are tender and helpless," said Klaus. "But I love to nip the tender ones," declared Jack. "The old ones are tough and tire my fingers." "The young ones are weak and cannot fight you," said Klaus. "True," agreed Jack. "Well, I will not pinch a child this night if I can resist the temptation," he promised. "Good night, Klaus." "Good night." The young man went in and closed the door, and Jack Frost ran on into the village. Klaus threw a log on the fire, which burned up brightly. Beside the hearth sat Blinky, a big cat given him by Peter the Knook. Her fur was soft and glossy, and she purred never-ending songs of contentment. "I shall not see the children again soon," said Klaus to the cat, who kindly paused in her song to listen. "The winter is upon us. The snow will be deep for many days, and I shall be unable to play with my little friends." The cat raised a paw and stroked her nose thoughtfully, but made no reply. So long as the fire burned and Klaus sat in his easy chair by the hearth, she did not mind the weather. So passed many days and many long evenings. The cupboard was always full, but Klaus became weary, with nothing to do more than to feed the fire with the big wood pile the Knooks had brought him. One evening he picked up a stick of wood, and he began to cut it with his sharp knife. He had no thought at first except to occupy his time, and he whistled and sang to the cat as he carved away portions of the stick. Puss sat up on her haunches and watched him, listening at the same time her master's merry whistle, which she loved to hear even more than her own purring songs. Klaus glanced at Puss and then at the stick he was whittling, until presently the wood began to take a shape, and the shape was that of the head of the cat, with 2 ears sticking up. Klaus stopped whistling to laugh, and then both he and the cat looked at the wooden image in some surprise. Then he carved out the eyes and the nose, and rounded the lower part of the head so that it rested upon a neck. Puss hardly knew what to make of it now, and sat up stiffly as if watching with some suspicion about what would come next. Klaus knew. The head gave him an idea. He plied his knife carefully and with skill, forming slowly the body of the cat, which he made to sit upon its haunches as the real cat did, with her tail wound around her 2 front legs. The work cost him much time, but the evening was long and he had nothing better to do. Finally, he gave a loud and delighted laugh at the results of his labors, and he placed the wooden cat, now completed, upon the hearth, opposite of the real one. Puss thereupon glared at her image, raised her hair in anger, and uttered a defiant meow. The wooden cat paid no attention, and Klaus, much amused, laughed again. Then Blinky advanced towards the wooden image to eye it closely and smell of it intelligently. Eyes and nose told her the creature was wood, in spite of its natural appearance, so Puss resumed her seat and her purring. But as she neatly washed her face with her padded paw, she cast more than one admiring glance at her clever master. Perhaps she felt the same satisfaction we feel when we look upon good photographs of ourselves. The cat's master was himself pleased with his handiwork, without knowing exactly why. Indeed, he had great cause to congratulate himself that night, and all the children throughout the world should have joined him in rejoicing, for Klaus had made his very first toy. And that's the end of our tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more stories. Until then, bye for now.